wartime requirements of more than 5 million tons per year, it is apparent that the steel industry became directly dependent on the availability of merchant shipping. Thus, the state of health of steel production could be said to be directly dependent on the operation of United States submarines.
Japan's chief supply of oil came from America in the years prior to the war. Therefore, since the war started, our water requirements, which amounted to about 5 million tons a year, had to be supplied mostly from the Dutch East Indies. One of the decisive factors in our defeat was the activities of American submarines, which cut off the supply from that source entirely.
Our records show that about 36% of the major vessels, that is vessels larger than destroyers, were lost to the United States submarines.
Actually, Admiral Nagano is pretty accurate in his estimates. The latest reports, and we've checked and double-checked them, show that 1 battleship, 9 carriers, and 15 cruisers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were sunk by Allied submarines. He might have added, though, that 42 destroyers and 28 submarines were sunk in the same way.
Not a bad few years' work. By the way, I noticed the Admiral didn't give any figures on their merchant marine.
Well, that's understandable. It must be quite a painful subject to him. There just isn't any more Japanese merchant marine. Our submarines accounted for 63% of that important branch. Mr. Nomura probably could have told you that 104 of his vitally needed tankers were victims of submarines. Their merchant marine was destroyed on the high seas, in the ports of the Japanese Empire, and even in the shallow waters off the China coast, where the submarines had to operate as PT boats since there was insufficient water for diving.
Admiral, do you think in these articles we're writing, we could explain why, during the war, there was so little publicity given our subs and the shellacking they were handing the Japs?
I wish you would. It was just something that couldn't be helped. At the beginning of the war, some civilians visited the front and then broke into print and they got back about how American submarines didn't fear Japanese destroyers. They boasted that the nip depth charges weren't big enough to hurt us and weren't set deep enough to reach us. You can imagine how joyfully the Japs received that news. They radically changed their tactics and we lost, I should say, about 10 submarines with all on board before we could improve our instructions sufficiently to slow the Japs down.
Is that when you became the silent service?
Right then and there. We buttoned up our lip instead of torpedoes. Besides, there was too much work to do to permit talking about it. Just visualize the spot we were in, December 7th, 1941. There wasn't time to be bitter. It was up to us, the small ships. The big ones were out of the picture.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Yes, it was up to the submarines. At that time, we had exactly 51 submarines in the Pacific, and that included 12 of the old S-class. Small and slow, but they gave a good account of themselves. On December 15th, 8 days after Pearl Harbor, American subs drew their first blood. The Swordfish was cruising off Hainan Island in the South China Sea. On the radio, they could hear the voice of a Japanese woman speaking faultless English. Later, she would become famous as Tokyo Rose.